Hi, this is Tim Weber from South Texas College, coming to you with another lecture video. This time, we're going to have a look at psychological theories of personality. So let's begin by considering the definition of personality, which is an individual's characteristic pattern of thinking, feeling, and acting. So this is then an individual difference from one person to another in terms of how they respond in their cognition, how they process information and think about things, as well as emotions. What are typical emotional states for that person, emotional responses, and then behavior in terms of actions. So maybe a nice way to illustrate personality is to consider the story of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And if you remember that story from childhood, each of the dwarves had names like bashful, happy, dopey, grumpy, and so forth. And each of those names sort of characterized a key personality trait of that individual, cardinal trait of that individual. And so if you knew their name, you sort of knew what to expect from them in terms of how they thought about things, their emotional states, their behaviors. So that's kind of a good way to think of it. So each dwarf had a distinct, unique personality. Each person then is going to have a unique personality as well. One of the first attempts to try to deal with the whole concept of personality was Sigmund Freud and his psychoanalytic perspective. Now, before we go into the theory, just want to make a couple comments about it. A lot of times when we hear from modern psychologists, we hear a lot of criticisms of Freud. Some modern psychologists to the point where they almost seem to give the sense that Freud really didn't offer anything of value. And while it is true that Freud's theory is very difficult to test scientifically, maybe impossible to fully test, yet many of the things that Freud brought forth do seem to have some value. Now, much of what Freud also proposed was not a common belief in his day, but much of that was absorbed by the culture to the point where today many of Freud's ideas, we just all assume they're true, don't realize that really that's the source of those ideas. So we tend to end up being left with simply Freud's errors and evaluating his errors, and there were numerous errors he made. And so only seeing sort of the negatives of his theory. So I had to mention that there are many positives to the theory as well. Secondly, I also wanted to mention that when we talk about Freud's theory, it's really not one theory, but a whole bunch of theories, because Freud was constantly altering, revising, changing his theory. So you almost have to say, well, his theory at what point in time? So we're going to be generalizing about Freud's theory here. So Freud attempted then to come up with a comprehensive theory of personality that could explain all aspects of it, including its development. Some key features of his theory include the unconscious mind, psychosexual stages, and defense mechanisms, and we'll get into what all those are. So here's Freud's model of the mind. You might say it was kind of like an iceberg. So in Freud's view, most of the mind was not visible to us. It was kind of like the iceberg below the water, not something that we could directly experience. So most of it hidden from us, and only the tip of the iceberg, only a few aspects of the mind then were available to our conscious awareness. Conscious mind then only making up a small portion of our fuller mental activity. So Freud then set out to explore the contents of the unconscious, Well, how do you get information about that? You can ask people, but well, if it's unconscious, they don't know. So Freud attempted a variety of ways of accessing this information. He tried hypnosis, but was not terribly successful using that. So he eventually came up with this technique that was called free association, to tap into the unconscious. And basically what he did is he had the person to relax, lay down maybe on a sofa here, and simply say whatever came to mind. And he then believed that the contents of the unconscious would eventually sort of bubble up to the surface, if you will, and be expressed, maybe not directly, maybe in figurative or in disguised symbolic form, but in some way, those that unconscious material would be expressed. So after then observing the results of free association with many of his patients, Freud being actually a medical doctor, he observed that the unconscious must be filled with sexual and aggressive urges, things that were necessary for our, uh, our survival and that of our ancestors, and of all sorts of wishes and memories. And these wishes and memories might be unacceptable to us, even maybe frightening, things that we would not want to be aware of. And then all sorts of anxiety provoking, taboo sorts of urges. Urges of, well, maybe things like incest and who knows what all. So Freud saw the unconscious being filled with many, many scary things. So he then proposed that the personality and elements of it developed in order to resolve conflicts between powerful biological urges such as sexual and aggressive urges and social restraints. So the idea being, yes, we've inherited these biological impulses from our ancestors for survival purposes, but in order to have any sort of cohesive group and any sort of civil society, those biological impulses had to be restrained. Those sexual and aggressive urges had to be held back. And so this led then to the development of the couple of the elements of the personality, the id being those biological impulses, sexual and aggressive, which Freud believed were present from birth. So the id being present from birth. And you notice in the diagram, the id also being completely unconscious. So we could not be directly aware of the actual activity going on there. Now, this led then to the development of these social restraints, which is what he called the superego. So these would be the morals and the rules that we live by in order that we could have some sort of social order. Now let's have a look then at the three basic elements of the personality that Freud then proposed. First of all, the id, as we mentioned, unconsciously striving to satisfy sexual and aggressive drives and operating on the pleasure principle. So the id is going to urge us to do things that feel good, avoid things that are unpleasant. The id also very infantile, demanding immediate gratification, just like little babies. Doesn't want something in a few minutes, it wants it now. So notice the id doesn't evaluate those urges, just like little babies don't think about whether what they want is okay or not, or whether it's realistic. Okay, so the id, we'd say pleasure principle, a key element of it. Now that superego that we mentioned a minute ago, this then is the element of the personality that provides our moral compass. It tells us whether we should or shouldn't do something. Okay. It also then would be the source of our conscience, that thing that tells us if we've done something that's not right. And it therefore produces pride, shame, and guilt. If we do what's consistent with the superego says that we should do, well, then we're going to have a sense of pride. I did the right thing, a good person. On the other hand, if we violate what the superego says we should not do, then we're going to have a sense of guilt. I did a bad thing. Or maybe even shame, being I'm a bad person. In fact, according to the theory, the superego really demands that we kind of be punished for violating its edicts. And if we are not punished by our circumstances or but someone else, the superego may demand that we, in fact, punish ourselves, if you will. The third element of the personality, then, which Freud saw as developing out of this whole scenario, is the ego. The ego develops in order to be a mediator between the id and superego, because sometimes what the id desires violates what the superego says we shouldn't do. So there has to be a go-between to work out some sort of compromise between these two elements of the personality. The ego operates on the reality principle. So it evaluates various urges that we have in terms of, well, what's realistically going to happen if you do that? So notice that it is evaluating differently than the superego operating on the morality principle, if you will. Now, we can also note how this particular idea would suggest that there is potential for great inner conflict within a person. Let's go back here to this diagram here, and let's see, I need something to write with here. Oh, I'm not used to doing this. Oh, hang on. Okay, there we go. All right. So let's just use an example. And by the way, child alert here. Some of these examples we use might not be appropriate for children. So if you got kids around, you might want to have them go do something else while we use some of these examples here with Freud. Anyways, okay, so let's suppose that we've got a guy, college age guy, and his id produces an urge that he go and have sex with his best friend's girlfriend. And this is something that Freud might actually suggest could occur. So now, this urge to do so is going to be evaluated by the person's ego. Okay, the ego is going to evaluate on the reality principle. So what might the ego conclude? Well, maybe the ego looks at that urge and says, well, I don't know. That's maybe not such a good idea, because if you do that, you're going to lose a good friend. Maybe not such a good idea. Or maybe, yeah, if you do that, your friend is probably going to come around and beat you up if you do that when he finds out. Or maybe the ego is going to say, hey, be realistic, dude. That ain't going to happen. She doesn't even like you at all. So notice we have now a conflict between id and ego. Now, this same urge also may be evaluated. Oh, by the way, I guess I should say, is it possible that the ego might evaluate that and say, okay, go ahead? Well, yeah, I suppose so. If the person believed that it's possible for them to do that, get away with it, the ego might evaluate that in a more positive way. But in fact, it may do so in a conflictual sort of way. Now, the same urge also will be evaluated by the superego as well. Now, what can happen there? Well, good chance, at least in our society, that that superego is going to look at that and say, well, you shouldn't do that. Because why? Well, it's not right. It's not right to do that to your friend, right? And so here we have another set of conflicts as well. Is it possible the person's superego evaluates that and says, go ahead, it's okay? I suppose so. If their moral structure was such that they didn't believe those kind of things to be wrong, then that's possible. But more likely, we're going to have a conflict in our culture with that. Now, notice there's also potential for conflict here between ego and superego. Because, in fact, the ego might evaluate that as a no. So no, you shouldn't do that because it's wrong. But the ego might say, well, yeah, but you know what? You could get away with it, dude. So there you have another potential conflict. So notice that this whole scenario really enables all sorts of conflicts to go on within the person. Uh-oh, gotta erase, folks. There we go. Okay. Now, personality development, according to Freud, occurred as the person passed through a number of what he called psychosexual stages during early childhood. And notice in Freudian theory, by the time one becomes an adult, uh, one's personality is pretty well set and pretty difficult, if not impossible, to change. So, what are these psychosexual stages? Well, Freud believed that the id contained pleasure seeking energies, psychic energy that really our whole psyche operated on, which he expressed as being sexual. And he thought of as being sexual. And these urges, then, these energies, would focus on pleasure sensitive areas of the body at different points in time, different parts of the body at different stages. These areas of the body is then known as erogenous zones. So the idea then goes that as one is going through those psychosexual stages, at each stage, there is going to be a conflict that arises. It's going to be a conflict between the person's natural urges, the id, and social restraints, restrictions that are being put upon those urges. So if one is able to come to grips with that conflict, work their way through it, make the adaptations that are necessary, and complete that stage, one goes on to develop normal personality. However, if a stage is not successfully completed, or if conflicts in that stage are not resolved, then the person ends up fixed in that stage. They can't move forward to complete the tasks of the next stages. And therefore, due to these fixations, the person's adult personality and their adult functioning is going to be impaired. So here's a quick rundown on these psychosexual stages. The oral stage, up till about 18 months for babies, pleasure centers on the mouth. And if you've been around babies, yeah, you know they enjoy what? Biting on things, chewing, sucking on things. Um, Probably kind of important because it enables them to feed and so forth. And so according to the theory, though, the crisis that develops is somebody comes along and they want to put in restrictions on this activity. Somebody comes along and says, hey, wait a minute, you can't put that in your mouth, that's dirty. Or you can't just go around biting people for the whatever you feel like it. Yeah. Oh, by the way, who's that? Who's likely to be the person who's saying that many times? Oh, the child's mother. You notice, yeah, mom seems to take a lot of blame in Freud's theories when people have problems later. But at any rate, then the theory then goes that, well, if the person ends up with a fixation in the oral stage, if they cannot complete it, then this is going to impair them as an adult with an oral um, fixation. And so this might be the adult that what talks too much, eats too much, makes biting comments towards others, uh, has a problem with always chewing their fingernails, hands in their mouth, or you get the idea. Okay. The second stage, the anal stage, that's about 18 months through 3 years old. Here, the pleasure now focuses on holding one's waists and eliminating their waists. And the child is having great fun doing that however they like. And then along comes somebody that says, oops, you can't do it like that anymore. And what do we have? The potty training. And as some of you know, yeah, some kids kind of resist that. Um, you can kind of see where Freud's observations may be sort of accurate here, even if we don't agree with his conclusions. Well, so at any rate, Freud's theory was if you had then a parent who was too harsh with the potty training, you ended up with an anal retentive adult. And just like a little kid where you put them on the potty and they got to go, but they won't do it. This person as an adult is going to be a person who's real controlling, real stingy. They're going to be real tight with their things. And so they're going to be a control freak. Everything has to be a certain way, anal retentive. Now, on the other hand, if the parent was too lax, in this case, you would have what he called an anal expulsive adult, kind of like a little kid that just, goes and lets it rip anywhere. Yeah. And so this person then, as an adult, would be sloppy, messy, messes up other people's projects and so forth. So it has a lot to do with control. Um, Now, by the way, how much scientific evidence do we have to actually document these oral or anal fixations? And I'm going to say, really, it's not really testable scientifically. I know I kind of searched the literature to find studies that really could document this. Pretty hard to do because you can ask people, well, what do you think your potty training was like? But they don't really remember it. And you might ask parents, but who are they comparing it to? And so it's really hard to do that. About the best I could come up with, I came up with one study where they found that people who were believed to have had harsh potty training were more likely to have constipation as adults. So there you go. Just really hard to test, not a lot out there. Maybe there's a little bit more since the last time I looked for that kind of stuff, but okay, limited. Um, the next stage, phallic stage, age 3 through 6, what you have is this whole Oedipal and Electra complex that we'll talk about in a minute. Basically, the main conflict here is dealing with incestuous sexual feelings and an inappropriate attachment to the parent of the other sex, basically. We'll get in more detail in a moment. But let's finish it off here. So there was then a latency period from around age 6 through puberty. Those sexual feelings and childhood conflicts go dormant. And so the person then could be educated because they weren't distracted by these things. And then finally, when you got to puberty, then you enter the genital stage, and the desires then were satisfied through normal sexual activity. Okay, so what about this phallic stage, age 3 through 6, Oedipus complex? Okay, so this would be a boy's sexual desire for his mother, feelings of jealousy, hatred towards their father, which would be their rival. Now, you're probably saying, well, if you're a boy particularly, you say, well, I don't remember having any of those kinds of feelings towards my mother when I was that age. And Freud would say, well, of course you don't. That's taboo. And if you actually recognize that you had those kind of feelings, you'd go crazy. And so you've repressed those now. They're still in there somewhere, but you're no longer aware of them. So in this case, the boy wants mom all to himself, wants to get rid of dad. Um, Freud also eventually proposed that there was a similar process with girls, similar but different. In this case, the girl developed this incestual desire for her father, known as the Electric Complex. So, well, how is all of this stuff resolved? Because in the case of the Oedipus complex and the boy is plotting to get rid of his father, murder him, but that produces a lot of anxiety because, wow, dad is bigger and stronger. And what if dad finds out? Freud proposed, yeah, the boy concludes, well, dad would find out, he's going to castrate me. So, wow, pretty frightening, right? So, Freud then believed that the resolution of this was identification. So the boy finally realizes, well, if I can't beat dad, I can't get rid of him. Well, if you can't beat him, what do? You join them and you identify with them. So the boy would cope with those threatening feelings by repressing the feelings, those incestuous desires, and then identifying with that rival parent. So the boy now joins dad. He begins imitating him, his interest, his mannerisms, his actions, as you see little boys doing a lot of times. And therefore, it's kind of the idea, well, if I can't have mom, maybe if I'm like dad, I can get somebody kind of like mom someday. And for girls, sort of a similar process in identifying with their mother. And again, if I can't have dad all to myself, well, maybe I'll be able to get somebody like dad by identifying with mom. And this also, Freud connected with the development of the superego and imitating the values of the parent as well. So all of that, you're probably thinking that's pretty weird stuff. And again, how well can we document this? It's sort of hard to document. Um, so we'll move on to some things of Freud's theory that I think you will find to be more readily observable and maybe a little bit easier to digest, and that of defense mechanisms. So defense mechanisms are strategies that the ego uses to reduce anxiety. Now, so because we, according to this theory, have all sorts of anxiety-provoking sorts of uh, urges, feelings, memories from early childhood, so forth, we're going to want to avoid these. And so what we do, you might sort of liken these urges, memories, and so forth to a scary monster. So what do? We, oops, here we go, maybe. All right, so we take those urges, conflicts, and we lock them away in the unconscious. So we raise the bars here. So, oh, now it's not so scary. It's all locked up, right? Now, what's the problem with locking up a monster? Well, first of all, is the monster just going to stay there? No, it's going to try to force its way out. And so, in fact, these defense mechanisms are limited. We try to keep things out of our awareness with these defense mechanisms, but the more we try to do so, the more those urges and thoughts try to break their way into our awareness. So what do? Well, we begin reinforcing the bars even more, doubling them up, and using defense mechanisms more and more to sort of keep that thing back. Oh, there's one other problem with this. If you lock up a monster, how is it affected by that? Not only does it want to get out, but as it's frustrated in getting out, it gets what? More angry, more dangerous, more frightening as it does. Now, the use of defense mechanisms also distort reality. They make us feel okay when there's really something scary in there. And so we're sort of denying that we have these urges and thoughts and memories and so forth. So that's how defense mechanisms work. If we use them too much, we actually begin losing touch with reality. Now, Freud believed that we all use them somewhat and kind of had to just to function. But if we go too far with it, all of a sudden now we've gotten so far from reality, we're really out of it. So let's look at some examples of these defense mechanisms. Yeah, how do I do that? I have to clear all that, then I can go on. Sorry about the delays, guys. And here we go. Okay, so the mother of them all is repression. So repression banishes anxiety arousing thoughts, feelings, and memories completely from consciousness. So, for example, traumatic event occurred. Person is no longer aware that that even occurred. They have no conscious awareness. That's repression, okay? Now, if the person can remember it, it's not repression, it's suppression. They're simply choosing not to. So repression, person has no awareness of that traumatic event. Another example would be regression. And here, when under stress and anxiety, the person retreats to a more infantile psychosexual stage. So we might see here a child who is a preschooler and going to preschool for the first day. They seem fine going in, but by the end of the day, mom comes to pick them up, and there they are over in the corner, all in a fetal position, sucking their thumb. And what are they doing? They're regressing to an earlier stage of development where they felt safer and secure. And mom will say, gosh, they quit sucking their thumb when they were, 2 years old. They haven't done that since then. Well, they're going back to that time when they felt more secure. Another example of this might be some forms of bedwetting. Okay, so, and this is something that clinical psychologists will occasionally encounter. They may have a child brought to them, and the parent indicates that the child has begun to wet the bed. Maybe they're, say, 8 years old or something like that. Um, they've taken them to the medical doctor. Doctor has examined them. There's nothing wrong with their bladder and their muscles to control it, the nervous system there and all that. The doctor has, medical doctor says, well, there doesn't seem anything physically wrong. Maybe a clinical psychologist can help you. So the psychologist begins asking some questions and finds that the child is under some significant stress. Maybe it's something like maybe the child's favorite pet has passed away, or maybe the parents are arguing and the child is frightened that maybe their parents are going to split up and leave them behind. But at any rate, the bedwetting may be manifesting that stress. And again, going back to an earlier age where they felt safer and more secure. And even more commonly, with us as adults, we may have things that bother us. And you might say, I cried like a baby. Well, there you go. You're sort of regressing towards that time when you felt safer and more secure. Another example would be called reaction formation. So what's going on here? The ego is unconsciously switching the behavior to the exact opposite of which an unacceptable impulse would produce. So it's sort of changing the actual urge it manifested in the behavior to its opposite. So for example, maybe we've got a guy and this guy has been taught that to be homosexual would be the most horrible thing possible, but yet deep down they have homosexual urges. In order not to be aware of that and to avoid the anxiety that would produce in violating what was they were told would be acceptable, the ego may switch that to its opposite. So now the guy becomes, Mr. Macho Man, and real tough, goes around and criticizes gay people and so forth. And in fact, this may be a way of not becoming aware of their own urges. If you can act the opposite, well, how could you possibly be that? If you're Mr. Macho, how could you possibly be gay? Or here's another example of this. So maybe a person is actually very angry with someone. Maybe they've been mistreated by them, but they find themselves treating them with courtesy and friendliness. You say, why am I treating them so nice? They've been mean. Well, maybe we don't want to face that, yeah, we really do have some very angry feelings or maybe destructive feelings towards that person. So as we act the opposite, we are not aware of it. Another example, projection. So here, people disguise their own threatening impulses by attributing them to others. So they see that disowned urge in others, something about themselves that they don't want to own. Okay. A classic example of this, person that has an unconscious desire to cheat on their spouse or boyfriend or girlfriend, not wanting to be aware of that, their ego may convert this into the perception that their partner is being unfaithful to them when there's no real evidence. Yeah, and the partner looks around and says, "What? Where did you get that idea?" Well, in fact, there's no evidence of it. This is actually that other person's unconscious desire. I see that sometimes. Or you see this in the person that maybe has been told it's terrible to be aggressive towards others, yet they have aggressive urges deep down. To not become aware of it, what do? They point out how other people are aggressive and mean. And look at that SOB, how mean they are, right? And as long as you're pointing at the other person, you don't have to be aware that you, in fact, have that very urge yourself. Rationalization is another one. And so here, when we do something that we would see to violate, again, what we believe to be right, what is moral for us, we offer self-justifying explanations in place of the real, more threatening and unconscious reason for your actions. So as an example, you have an alcoholic that knows that they can't take a drink, that they're going to lose control, but they do anyways, and they get drunk. And so do they typically say, yeah, well, I just got drunk because I just love to get drunk, you know? Not usually. What will they typically say? Something like, well, it's been real stressful. I had to calm my nerves, or it was a really hot day, so I cool off. Or how about this one? Oh, everybody else had a drink, so I had to have one to fit in. Right? So they're not really admitting the real reason to themselves. They're instead offering some justification. Or how about this one? The parent who's punishing their child really because they're angry at them, but what do they tell themselves and they tell the child, I'm doing this for your own good. Not really wanting to admit to themselves that no, really they're doing that because they want to get even. Yeah, it happens, right? Okay. Or here's one, displacement. So this shifts a sexual or aggressive impulse towards a more acceptable or less threatening target, less threatening object or person. For example, redirecting anger towards a safer outlet. So here's an example of that. Maybe something goes on at work and a person is angry at their boss. So do they go and they attack their boss? Oh no, that wouldn't be a good idea. You might lose your job, or maybe they'd sue you. So what do you do instead? Well, maybe you bang your fist on the wall, or maybe, maybe you take it out on one of your coworkers, or maybe you hold it in until you get home, and then when you get home, you take it out on your husband, wife, you know, or maybe your children, and kind of treat them mean. Yeah. Or maybe when nobody's looking, you know, you kick the family dog a little bit. Yeah. So this is kind of passing it on to a target that can't fight back, if you will. Yeah. Does this happen with kids? Oh yeah. Parent punishes a child for something. Child's angry because they've been punished. So what do? Maybe they go and torture their little brother or sister or the family pet, or maybe they go in the house and they destroy something in the house. And you think, God, what did they do that for? And it may be, yeah, displaced anger that they're not dealing with up front. In fact, they're again aiming it towards a target that doesn't fight back. Now, there are numerous other defense mechanisms that were proposed by Freud, as well as Anna Freud, his daughter, and many other psychoanalytic theorists, but those are some examples. So that brings us then to the Neo-Freudians, who also shared the psychoanalytic viewpoint that unconscious motives and drives were key in the formation of our personality. Many of these, being followers of Freud, accepted many aspects of his theory, but significantly altered it in some way. So many suggested that there were additional unconscious urges beyond those of sex and aggression. Urges, say, for maybe to create things, or maybe urges to develop one's full potential, or maybe urges to even help others, or urges for close relationships, and so on. Um, Many of these Neo-Freudians also placed more emphasis on the conscious mind and its ability to deal with problems and solve problems. There was also amongst Neo-Freudians generally more emphasis on social interaction between mother and child action and parental actions as well. And many Neo-Freudians saw personality development as taking place beyond just early childhood. So numerous differences from the Freudian theory. So we'll look at a couple Neo-Freudians just to get a sense of some of it. You have Alfred Adler. So Adler, like Freud, did believe that unconscious anxiety was a driver of personality formation. However, his view that unconscious anxiety was based on social comparisons, comparing ourselves with others. So Adler suggested that as children, we look around at the adults in our world and we see what they can do. We look at mm, their abilities, maybe even our older brothers or sisters, and they seem almost godlike to us in their abilities. And so we sort of feel kind of weak, sort of powerless, sort of inferior. So we look around then for ways that we can feel more powerful. So how we then chose to feel more powerful then kind of becomes the key to our personality. So if we're a kid and we feel powerless and we look around and we say, you know what, if I was real smart, then I'd feel more powerful. So that person then is going to become the studious, kind of intellectual kind of person and gravitate to that in their personality. Maybe another child looks around and says, you know, if I had a lot of friends, you know, I'd really feel more powerful then. And so they become social and outgoing. Or you have another who looks around and says, you know, if I became real athletic, I'd feel more powerful. And so they go on to be that sort of person that focuses on their physical development and so forth. So Adler saw then the social comparison driving our personality development. Now, in fact, he also suggested that some people never overcome these feelings of inferiority. So, in fact, if the person is still struggling with feelings of inferiority as an adult, we say they have an inferiority complex. Well, how do we help that person? Well, we help them discover ways that they can feel more powerful. Yeah, okay. So, if you ever wondered where the idea of the inferiority complex comes from, there you go, Alfred Adler. So next we'll have a look at Carl Jung. And this theory, his psychoanalytic theory, is a rather complex theory. So I can't really explain the entire thing in one sitting, but I'll try to at least give you some sense of some key ideas in here and how that might be applicable to maybe your personal experience. So first of all, Jung differed from Freud in the structure of the unconscious. Freud believed in a personal unconscious that was our own personal wishes, urges, and memories. Jung expanded this to also include what he called the collective unconscious. And so this contained inherited mental structures, patterns, and concepts that we share with all humans from throughout history. And so sort of an inherited unconscious that was universal. And Jung would suggest that's why you would see people of very different cultures often having very similar symbols for things, even if they had no connection with one another. And this also contained what he called archetypes, these being what? Innate, built-in, universal patterns of being and doing that were shared by all humans. So archetypes then might be things like the pattern of the mother and child, and both of those patterns of being and doing, the wise old man, the old fool on the other side of that, the tree of life, which you find in so many cultures and so forth. So these things then were things that we might access as we had need of them in our daily activities. So the development of one's personality then eventually required the process of individuation, becoming, your own individual. So becoming that unique individual, self-actualization then would be achieved through a process of integrating conscious and unconscious elements of our personality. Now, how would that be done? Well, one way it could be done would be through participating in analysis, a type of therapy that Jung developed. This also might be done through reflection on one's person, reflecting about oneself, and could be done through exercises in active imagination, imagining various scenarios and how one might behave in those scenarios, potential ways that one could, letting one's imagination kind of run free in those scenarios. Could also be done through the interpretation of dreams, and finally through actions one might take to discover elements of their personality that they were not yet conscious of. So this whole process then involved dealing with a number of issues. Now, first of all, the self. This would be ideally where we have a full unification of that person's conscious and unconscious mind. So all of it has been brought together. So individuation then is required to develop the self. And ideally, the self then contains, well, it does contain all those aspects of the individual, but one now becomes able to integrate those, to use those to work together. So in order to then develop the self, or realize it, maybe be a better word, one has to be aware of the persona. And by the way, persona is one of those archetypes. And what's persona? It's derived from the Latin word for mask. So the persona involves many different social masks that we wear in different situations in different groups. And you know, we present ourselves differently depending upon situations. Now, Jung would suggest that, well, maybe that's sort of necessary to operate in our social environment to some extent. We can't always tell everybody, you know, just exactly how we think and feel and just let everything hang out, you know. So maybe we, you know, kind of need to have those, use those from time to time. However, what we have to be aware of is those are not really us. They're not really our true self, that those are masks that we're wearing. And yes, these are a form of protection, but they also can blind us to aspects of ourselves if we begin thinking that that mask, that persona is really us. Okay, then also we have to deal with the shadow. So this is, it says here, dark side of the psyche. Now, when we say dark side, we're not saying necessarily bad, evil, okay? Could contain things that we might typically think of as bad or evil, but we're thinking more like the dark side of the moon. Okay, you know, like, yeah, what's on the dark side of the moon? I don't know, who knows? Unless you can send some spaceship over there, look, right? So those are the things that we can't readily see about ourselves, the shadow. Some of this maybe then what? Repressed memories, ideas that we've had that we've abandoned and repressed emotional reactions to things. These may be weaknesses that we have again repressed that we're not aware of, or desires that we have that again we have denounced as not being really us, or instincts that again we won't let ourselves see that we really have. So these are all the things about ourselves that we have sort of pushed over into that shadow. And so again, becoming aware of just what is contained in that shadow is going to then illuminate many aspects of our personality that we weren't aware of. Some of it might be scary, some of it we might not like that it's part of us, but some of it might contain pure gold. Notice the shadow also represents what? Wildness, chaos, the unknown. People are kind of scared to confront it. But yet, as they do, if they can do so in a constructive sort of way, they begin discovering things about themselves that they didn't know. And many of those things are going to be valuable to us. Okay. Then we also have the anima animus. Okay. So the anima refers to the feminine, animus to masculine. And so Jung's view was that we contain both of these qualities. It wasn't that animus was only for men or anima just for women. And in fact, the actual concept, feminine and masculine here, might be something we should delve into. Okay. Now, when we're thinking of feminine and masculine here, we're not necessarily thinking male and female, but rather these are qualities that were somewhat associated with male or female, but kind of have a life of their own. Okay, so with the feminine, we're thinking about things that are, well, let's start with the animus, the masculine. So that would be qualities that are what? Forceful, powerful, pushing forward. This would be involving passing judgment on things and protecting, amongst other things. Okay. The feminine would involve what? Being receptive, would be creativity, would be subtle rather than forceful. Okay, you know, you can often attain things in a subtle sort of way rather than forceful, right? Okay, you get the idea. So, different qualities. So, not male or female, masculine, feminine. And maybe think about this. English doesn't do a very good job on this, but some other languages like Spanish does better. Okay, so if you know anything about Spanish, you know, yeah, all kinds of objects and things can have masculine or feminine gender. Like, oh, you have what? El Sol, which is the sun, right? And that's a masculine word, although it's not necessarily male. But notice, yeah, the sun has qualities of what? Forcefulness and powerfulness and sort of, yeah, just, you know, barging in there, that sort of thing. Um, on the other hand, in Spanish, what? La luna, the moon. Notice the moon, more subtle, more mysterious, right? It causes you to be creative, thinking about things and so on. So, yeah, think of that more in terms of qualities, not sexual, but mm, different. Okay. So, here's the thing though. Often a person has sort of buried the um, the gender qualities or attributes of the psyche that is associated with the other gender. So males may have sort of buried attributes that are involved with being receptive to others. On the other hand, um, women might have sort of denied some of these more masculine traits, like the ability to be aggressive in attaining goals, so on. So the idea is we all have these qualities, but we may need to, again, rediscover some of these and integrate them into ourself for a full realization of our personality. Okay, so those are some of the ideas there of how one develops in their personality, moves forward. A little bit about those archetypes we mentioned. So, yeah, here's some examples. The hero. Yeah, you find that in every culture, right? In every story, there's a hero. Um, oh, notice there's also usually the opposite, right? The villain, the one that's always antagonistic to the hero. It's another archetype, right? Or the wise old man. And of course, you also have the old fool is another archetype that's sort of the other polar opposite of that. You have the mother archetype. You have the father archetype as well. You have the child archetype, including one of the ones that occurs in many stories, that of an orphan. You have the archetype of a magician. You have the dragon as an archetype. So these things, again, you'll find commonly in all kinds of stories from all sorts of cultures. Um, Notice that many of the myths and stories that we enjoy are really about individuation or are about these archetypes. Think about Superman, hero, right? Oh, interestingly, Superman also was an orphan. Or the Lion King, individuation, right? And discovering aspects of himself that he was not initially aware of. Or how about Pinocchio? Do you ever think about that movie, Pinocchio? I know a lot of y'all have seen that when you're kids, right? Pinocchio is this wooden puppet that talks and has its own will to do things, wants to be a real boy. And you think about this, you go, that's the most ridiculous thing you ever heard of. And yet, we sit there and watch that, and we go, hey, um, uh, it seems to make sense to us, kind of, even though the things that are in there just don't really make a lot of sense. Talking puppets that do what they want, and you know, yeah, and Geppetto is the puppet maker. Ends up going to the bottom of the sea, and then he's in a whale, and they're building a fire inside of a whale. You watch that stuff, how ridiculous, but yet we sit there and watch that. In fact, if somebody bothers us when we're watching, leave me alone, I'm watching this, right? We take it kind of serious. And well, here's the thing, it's because it does correspond to these archetypes, what's going on in here. And these stories that have become part of the pattern of our psyche, according to Jung, they're gonna be meaningful to us, even though on a different level they're kind of ridiculous. Um, oh, Wizard of Oz, if you ever get a chance to look at that, all kinds of archetypal sort of figures there. And also you have this process of individuation, each of those figures finding parts of themselves that they didn't know they had. The straw man finding that, he didn't think he had a brain, but also he did have that capability. Or, the Tin Man didn't think he had a heart, but he discovered he did. And Dorothy becoming an adult, and on and on and on. And so all of that. So yeah, a lot of stories that we watch really are archetypal stories. Okay, enough of Jung. Let's then look at, um, from the psychoanalytic perspective, how do we then assess what is going on unconsciously with an individual? Well, their method would be to use projective tests. These projective tests present ambiguous stimuli that could be interpreted many different ways in order to identify unconscious motives. How? Well, the person is shown that ambiguous stimulus, or it's presented to them, and then they're asked to respond to it in various ways. They may be asked to look at a picture and tell about what they think is going on in the picture, what's going to happen, what emotions it brings up, so on, and predict what's going to happen next. So the person's responses then interpreted to suggest hidden conflicts, inner motives, thoughts, other traits, their personality. So here's a couple examples. Okay, you have the thematic apperception test, TAT. And so in this test, the person's shown these picture cards. Um, these are not actually from it, but they're similar. Okay, and you can say here in this example, well, you have a woman that's there, and the person is asked to tell what they think is going on and what is going to happen. So maybe you have one person that looks at this and they say, I think that the person there, the lady here is sad because this guy just died. Okay. Another might look at it and say that, oh, well, um, maybe they fell down. Maybe the guy fell down drunk again. He's an alcoholic, and again, she's sad because he's back into his old ways. Oh, here's an interpretation. What if, hey, maybe she just killed him, and now she's regretting it? Or hey, maybe she just killed him, and actually she's laughing because, good, the son of a bitch is finally gone. Now notice that what they originally did is the person then giving the test would simply, well, speculate or guess as to what those responses meant. And so if the person, if they said, oh, well, yeah, you know, she's sad that he's died, maybe you have somewhat unprocessed issues about the death of someone that was close to you need to look into. Or if she says, I fell down drunk again. Yeah, well, maybe you got some alcohol issues. Or, well, if she killed him, maybe you have some murderous urges unconsciously that we need to deal with, and so on. Now, in fact, in many cases, those speculations really said more about the person who was making the interpretation than it did the person they were testing. So not very reliable, not very valid. But turns out maybe useful. What they then did is they began to collect data about what people who had various types of characteristics, personality, and behavioral characteristics would say. And as they kept those statistics, then we could refer to those statistics and might give some suggestions as to things we might follow up on in terms of issues that person might have. So yeah, a little bit valuable, but we sure can't tell anything for sure about a person using that type of test. Another one that was used very heavily, the Rorschach ink blot test. When Rorschach, 100 years ago or so, just spilled some ink on paper and folded it and came up with those things. They look similar to what you see here. This is not one of them, but again, people were shown these and then asked to tell what it looked like to them, what emotions they might feel as they look at it, so forth. And once again, originally interpretation might be simply guesswork. The person says, well, I see two animals fighting there. So maybe you have some aggressive urges that you're not aware of, lurking unconsciously, so on. Person sees eyes. Oh, maybe you're kind of paranoid. Yeah. Now, again, with this, they realized, oh, that's not a very good way of doing things. So they began collecting data as to what do people with various characteristics say, and one could then go to the research and could connect up what people were saying with what was sometimes connected with it. But again, only suggestive of things. Might just give the psychologist somewhere to start. Now, there's some problems with these types of tests. One being that, well, what we call stimulus pull. Sometimes these ink blots might actually look like a certain thing. I mean, on this one, well, it certainly does look like there's some eyes there. So if you're not paranoid, you're probably going to say, well, it's eyes, you know. So that's a problem. Another problem is, well, people can be dishonest about what they say. If you ever get the chance to see the movie Problem Child, watch it. It's absolutely hilarious. One of the funniest movies I've ever seen. But anyways, in this movie, there's this guy in prison, and he's a murderer, and he's up for parole. And so the prison psychiatrist is interviewing him. They're showing him the Rorschach cards, and the prisoner is saying things like, "Oh, I see fluffy bunnies. Oh, I see fuzzy bunnies. I see fluffy clouds. Things like that." And the warden is sitting in the back. And after a while, he just can't stand it anymore. And he finally jumps up and he says, he doesn't see fluffy bunnies and furry bunnies and fluffy clouds. He sees murder and mayhem. He's just lying to you. And that's the thing, is people can just lie about what they're seeing, try to manipulate the person examining them. So he's shaky at best, maybe suggestive, but we really have to be careful how to use those. Now that said, I do want to mention one actually projective test that is maybe a bit more revealing sometimes. Rotter's incomplete sentences. So these are sentences where the person is given the beginning of the sentence and they have to complete it. For example, here's one. My mother is. Yeah, go ahead and complete that one, right? Yeah, that might tell us a little bit about you if you're being honest, right? Yeah. Okay, but anyways, okay, projective test. All right, so that's all we're going to do on psychoanalytic. There's many more psychoanalytic theories. We've just scratched the surface to give you an idea. Let's have a look at what behaviorists had to say about personality. Remember, behaviorists were the psychologists that came along and said, well, for it to be the subject of psychology, it needed to be measurable and directly observable. So their idea about personality was that it really didn't exist. Oh, behaviorists are also learning theorists, right? And so they said personality was nothing more than learned responses, conditioned responses. And so the thinking patterns and actions, as well as emotional responses that had been consistently reinforced, then are going to be repeated, operant conditioning, right? And what you think of as personality is nothing more than conditioned response. So there you go, behaviorist perspective in less than 2 minutes. Aren't you glad that's over with? Okay, not much to say there, right? So now we move on to the humanist perspective. So this comes along somewhat later. Freud's theory, the end of the 1800s, early 1900s, and so on. So by, say, the late 1960s, there were many psychologists that were not totally excited about the psychoanalytic perspective. There were some questions about how accurate it was, difficulties testing it scientifically. And a lot of psychologists said, well, the psychoanalytic perspective is just too limiting because at least Freud's version of it was that, you know, whatever happened in your early childhood, if something went wrong there, well, you're marred for life and you can't overcome that unless you have a tremendous amount of therapy to discover the conflict and work through it. Other than that, you're stuck with your personality when you become an adult. So that's just too limiting. Now, they didn't like the behaviorist perspective either because, well, they said, well, that sort of just turns you into a robot being programmed by your environment. And we humans surely are more than that. We can make our own choices. We don't have to go along with what's found in our environment, what's being rewarded. And we don't have to be also constantly limited by our childhood experiences, the psychoanalytic theory. So they said, we want to come up with a theory that really recognizes human potential and our ability to make our own choices. And so that led to what they call the humanist perspective. Key figures would be Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. So Maslow advanced the idea or really promoted the idea of self-actualization beyond what it had ever been before. And so this was then the individual's potential to excel or to achieve something significant in their life. So this was kind of discovering what you were best suited for and becoming the best you could be at that. So his view was that's what drives us to develop our personality, this urge to self-actualize. So because our individual potentials differ, then we develop different traits in order to reach that individual potential that we have. The humanists also studied what seemed to be universal needs. For example, they found we humans all have needs for love and acceptance. And these were important in enabling us to move towards self-actualization. Here you see Maslow's hierarchy of needs that we talked about earlier. So we won't go over all of it, but no, that's a part of this humanist personality theory. So Carl Rogers was another who contributed a lot to this viewpoint. And he emphasized then the importance of unconditional positive regard. So this would be valuing a person no matter what. So our valuing of that person was not dependent upon whether they had certain beliefs or values, whether they did certain things. We simply valued that person, period. Notice that's in contrast to what we get a lot of times as kids growing up. We may be told, hey, you have to behave this way. You have to subscribe to these ideas and beliefs. And if you don't, we're not going to value you so much. Yeah. For us to value you, you have to be and do a certain do and be a certain way. So this is sort of in contrast with what a lot of people experience maybe from their parents, teachers, and so on as they grow up. So the idea, though, is that when one experiences unconditional positive regard, it freed them up to discover who they were and then develop their individual potential, enabled self-actualization. So the humanist um, idea on personality then is exemplified by this person-centered perspective. Okay, so that's sort of a form of humanist theory. And this suggested movement towards self-actualization is automatic if we've experienced what they called a growth enhancing climate. So what's that? Well, we've experienced someone who is genuine with us. So they respond to us in an honest way. They're authentic. They're being real with us. They're not faking the responses to us. And that individual then expresses empathy. I guess I should change these around. So we sense that that person has been able to identify how we think, how we feel. How do we know that? Because they've mirrored those things back to us as they hear us talk and express those. And as they mirror that back, we know that they're accurate in empathizing with us. They understand how we feel, think, so on. Then thirdly, yeah, I know it's out of order, we find from that person acceptance. So they value us no matter what. Now that has an effect because we know they're being real with us. They're not being fake. They really know how we are inwardly, and yet they still accept us. And so the idea is, well, if they can accept me, maybe I can accept things about myself that I previously didn't. Maybe I can discover things about myself that are of value and can develop those things. So people, given this growth enhancing climate, then develop what they called self-regard, positive self-regard. And that enabled them to move forward, developing their potential. So in assessing the personality of people, the humanist psychologists, not being that comfortable with pencil and paper tests or ambiguous stimuli, would instead interview the person and would seek to get a sense of that person's self-concept, how the person sees themselves. So that self-concept then contains a couple ideas. First of all, the person's ideal self. So this is how the person thinks that they should be, how they think they ought to be. And then secondly, the person's actual self. That's a little misleading. What it means is how they think they are. Now, a little misleading. Yeah, people don't always see themselves accurately, right? So when we say actual self here, it's how they see themselves, not necessarily perfectly how it is. Okay, now, if these two things were similar, then we can say the person has a positive self-concept. And humanists would predict that person is going to be able to move forward in developing their potentials in life and self-actualize. On the other hand, if there was a huge gap between these two things, then we might have a problem. Now we have a negative self-concept. Well, let's talk about that in a minute, what that means. Okay, so here's an example. Let's say we ask that person how they think they should be. Maybe they're a student, college student, and they say, well, let's say a college student who is 30 years old, okay? So they say, well, I think I should be finished with college by now, and I should be in a job earning $100,000. Okay, that's their ideal self. Oh, by the way, where does people's ideal self come from? You know, a lot of us would like to think, oh, we just dreamed it up ourselves, but really, in a lot of cases, it's ideas that others have what placed on us. Maybe we have a parent that says, you know, you got the potential to be a doctor or a lawyer or whatever. And so, yeah, we feel like, well, that's what we ought to be. Or maybe we've been told, we know you should, these are the correct values. These are the ones you should adopt. And we have pressure, maybe even from our friends, to adopt those values or to pursue that vocation. A lot of times it's not really us, it's someone else who's really suggesting this and then reinforcing us through what? Positive, or let's see, here we go, conditional positive regard. So, yeah, reinforcing that idea of what we should be by, okay, yeah, if you do well in school and take the courses you need to become that doctor or lawyer, or if you start developing those values and acting that way, then we're going to value you more. So you can see where this comes in. If there's not unconditional positive regard, that ideal self may not be what really is suitable for you, but what somebody else told you. But anyways, okay, so let's say we've got this person. They think they should be at age 30 done with college, um, and they should be earning 100,000 or more. Now, how do they think they are? Well, they know that they're not finished with college, they're not earning $100,000, and so they see themselves as what? A failure. Okay. Now, reality is they're not a failure, they're making progress, right? But they're going to have this negative self concept. What comes out of a negative self concept? Well, according to humanist theory, this negative self concept, if it's significantly negative, might produce what? Mm, anger, despair, frustration, maybe even cause people to give up, or might cause the person to strive for goals that are unsuitable for themselves. So, not a good thing, many cases. Now, I will say, on the other hand, my observation has been a small, a small difference between ideal and actual self can be kind of beneficial. So maybe you think you ought to be in a little bit better shape physically, but then you look at yourself and you go, well, I'm not there. If the gap is small, well, then you're probably say, but it's possible I could get there. I'm going to get busy and exercise and eat right, and I'll get there. So I'm going to say small gap, not a big deal, but major difference between the two, all kinds of negative sort of things. Oh, and by the way, all kinds of maladaptive behavior if we have a negative self-concept. You're not, you see yourself as being so far from the way you should be. You say, what's the use? What the hell? I might as well become a drunk, or, I might as well just give up, or I might as well just engage in destructive behavior and go around and harm people just for kicks or whatever. There's all kinds of negative things come out of that. So one of the things that's going to be the goal is how can we bring these things more in line with one another, so on. Okay, so there's what we got to say about humanist personality theory. We're going to stop here and we'll create another video to pick up the rest of the personality theories. So there you go.